Tonight we return to the subject of Plato's Republic, and we're on Book 6. Book 6 will deal with ontology and the structure of reality and how we know things. So this will be Plato's epistemology and his metaphysics. And as we saw last time in the last talk, we discussed the levels of knowledge and that some people love opinions and others love the truth. Philosophers love and follow what's true and know what's true, whereas the majority of people love opinion and mass perception. And that's what determines what's so-called true for them. Now, we're going to get pretty deep tonight, so in a brief overview of Book 6, we're going to be talking about the philosopher king and why it is that the ideal city or republic should be run by the philosopher king, and how suitable is this, how realistic can we actually get a philosopher king. And Plato's going to point out that only philosophers, as we said, have knowledge, and that alone is sufficient to qualify them to be the rulers. And that's provided, of course, that they aren't inferior to the non-philosophers in virtue. So Socrates will then try to show that they are in fact supremely virtuous, that is, the true philosopher. And then Adamantius will accept the arguments, but he will point out that the majority of people, they just simply go on believing that philosophers are not suited to be rulers, because they know from experience that most philosophers, this is the general popular view of the philosopher, is that they're kind of these vicious, unruly, argumentative, worthless types. And with there only being a few decent ones. Now, Socrates actually will agree with this, that the majority of philosophers actually are worthless flim-flam men and have no business doing what they do. I would agree. The people that the majority of humans, even in Plato's day, the people they take to be philosophers actually are vicious, useless people. But that is, of course, because the few decent ones who actually do possess the philosophical nature are actually not raised under the right sort of state or constitution in Plato's mind to where true philosophy can actually flourish. So the point then will be, if the majority ever saw a real philosopher, who had been properly bred and trained in virtue and so forth, then they would agree that this person should be the ruler of the city because he would be the wisest man. And certainly you would want the wisest man to be the ruler of your city and not the fools, because in situations of warfare or great stress, times of peril, you want wise people in charge and not the fools, or else the whole place will collapse. And as we said, the guardians must also, in quite an exact sense, be philosophic. Now, even though philosophy is not the primary goal of the guardians, there's a kind of graded hierarchy, or sort of a grade of being, chain of being, by which we rise up to the top of the philosopher king. And so for the masses at the bottom, philosophy is not what they have to worry about. And then for the guardian class above them, they should be more philosophical. And then above them, the philosopher king should be solely focused on philosophy. And that's how they'll be the best rulers. And as we rise up through these ranks, it's the virtues become more important. And this is where we're going to come to the issue of the line, geometry, and the analogy of the sun, which will be crucial for understanding Platonism and Platonic epistemology. Now, what's funny is that the beginning of this talk describes the sophists. And the sophists, of course, are the pseudo-philosophers, those who appeal to the masses, the pop philosopher who appeals to the mass by telling them what they want to hear. And it's precisely because the sophists, who are the relativists of their day, because they don't understand philosophy, they're kind of shills, we might say. They're kind of propagandists. They're kind of sophomoric do-it-yourselfers who, gadflies that latch on to a couple ideas here and there and use a few terms, and then they sound very philosophical. They sound reasonable. And so there's an interesting statement that I'll read here. Do you think then that there's any difference between the blind and those who are really deprived of the knowledge of each thing that is? The latter have no clear model in their souls, and so they cannot, in the matter of painters, look towards what is most true, make constant reference to it, and study it as exactly as possible. Hence they cannot establish here on earth conventions about what is fine or just or good, when they need to be established or guard or preserve them once they have been established. So in order for knowledge to be disseminated, it comes down through a proper hierarchy according to Plato and Socrates. And because the sophists are the fake philosophers, the phony balonies, crisis actor philosophers, they're not appropriate for the task. And they, in fact, then lead to the corruption of the city. People are misled, and they don't understand what philosophy really is or what it's about. And so we have a statement again that let's agree that philosophic natures, that is, the natures of people who are actually into philosophy and understand it, always love this sort of learning that makes clear to them the feature of the being that always is and does not wander about between coming to be and decaying, right? So the notion of being and becoming, the philosopher for Plato studies being, the true being, what is, not what's in constant change and flux, and you're not led about by the baubles and trinkets, you're not shifted in your beliefs and in your knowledge by the changing opinions of man, because men's opinions throughout history are constantly subject to change. But there are certain things that do not change. For example, geometric principles, right angles, things like this. And this is what Plato will use as an analogy to show that there is objective, ideational, noetic knowledge that doesn't change. And that this is the ground and starting point for true metaphysics and true being and true knowledge. The sophists, the fake philosophers, the materialists, people, other like alternative media, so-called philosophers out there who teach materialism, they're not real philosophers, precisely because they teach that empiricism is the end, is the result, the road to true knowledge, and that's the lowest form of knowledge, in fact. And so Plato, in fact, deals with that very issue here. And so the problem of the world and everyday space-time is not where we really get truth. Now, we do learn things from everyday space-time flux and the realm of becoming, but the realm of becoming is a medium, which points us to the higher realm, the realm of the intelligible world, the celestial realm, where things don't change, where 2 times 2 equals 4, regardless of how many pairs there are in front of you, right? If you have 4 pairs and the pairs rot over time, does that mean that 2 plus 2 no longer equals 4 because there's no empirical sense data of 2 plus 2 equaling 4? Of course not. And that's because 2 plus 2 equaling 4 is not determined by, bound by, or connected to in a necessary way to any specific instantiations or examples of 2 objects and 2 objects and 4 objects. This should be obvious, but the sophists can't get this, or they don't want to. Sense experience is and can be quite illusory, but 2 times 2 equaling 4 is not illusory. And so it's funny then that he talks about the falsehood that is perpetuated by the sophists. They must refuse to accept what is false, hate it, and then have a love for the truth. And that's the problem with the sophist, is that he doesn't love truth. Loving truth is a virtue. And the sophist, by his very nature, doesn't care and is fine with lies. And because he's fine with lies and has no love for the truth, he doesn't discover the truth. And so he's perpetually trapped in a realm of deception, phantasms, and empirical lies. The philosopher is not concerned ultimately with his bodily pleasures. But if you're an empiricist, if you're a materialist, then all there is bodily pleasures, right? That's ultimately the highest goal, is the, in some form or fashion, pleasing the body. That's all there is. There's no soul, there's nothing beyond this life. And so if that's the case, then material comforts and bodily pleasure are really all there is. And if that's all there is, then it follows that truth doesn't really matter, because there's nothing compelling you to believe in one thing over another thing. It doesn't matter. Why believe in truth or seek truth unless there's something eternal about it, something unchanging, and thereby directing oneself towards the highest good, the eternal good, and the form of good. Now, in theology, this would, of course, be God. And so this is why Platonism can be insightful for understanding theology. It's not ultimately the right theology. So for those who think that mistakenly I'm a Platonist, no. I would have to correct you there. I'm not a Platonist. It's just that the aspects of the metaphysics and the epistemology here are insightful for understanding theology. And theology is true philosophy. Interestingly, Plato will say that theology is what philosophy ultimately is too. Plato's conception of God, or the God, however, is quite different from what we would take to be the kind of God presented, say, in the Bible. Now, since the philosopher cannot be a person who's avaricious, greedy, a lover of money, a lover of popularity and fame, can't ultimately care about those things. If they come, so be it. If not, so be it. Because the philosopher's main concern is what's true. And therefore, that's why for Platonism you can't divorce ethics from metaphysics. If you could, then you could have people who are completely evil, wicked, and destructive who know what's true and are therefore guides to the rest of men. But you can't love falsehood and love truth at the same time. Those are impossibilities. And so we're kind of pulled in both directions as fallen humans, and we either go more so in one direction or more so in the other direction. And over time, the way that we choose to live then will affect the consequences of those actions. The philosopher is not concerned with death. He is, of course, righteous, as we saw in the Apology, and not worried about such matters, because he knows that if he's chosen truth and lived aright, then death is nothing to be afraid of. Because one is only afraid of death when one has a preponderance of material attachments, and the only thing that would cause a preponderance of material attachments would be materialistic philosophy. The philosopher is not petty. He doesn't care about being ripped off for $5 or for having something ill said of him in passing. The philosopher is above pettiness. And as we said, is not greedy or avaricious, but is concerned with knowledge or noetic light. Now, what is noetic light? Well, we'll find out here in a minute. The philosopher should also be of quality memory. Right? He should have a good power of recollection and reminiscence and memory. This will be required for the job of teaching and progressing in knowledge. The qualities, of course, will ultimately culminate in the ability to rule men wisely, because not all men have the exact same constitution, so to speak. They're not all fitted to rule. Some men are leaders, others are not. Men who are leaders are men who follow virtue and live aright and are able to lead others into truth, right? And this is kind of natural. We see this in the natural kingdom with certain animals being so-called alphas, right? And it's an analogy for the realm of teaching knowledge and philosophy for Plato. Now, most people think of philosophers as these useless, rambling windbags who don't really do anything but kind of sell themselves to gain a following and then, in some way try to be popular or make money or whatever it is that their particular vice might be. And certainly there's good reason to think that, and Plato agrees. There's so many sophists out there and people who think that they're philosophers. However, they do not actually know philosophy. They're stargazers, babblers, and good-for-nothings, we're told. And much the same happens in theology as well, where people believe that they're biblical scholars. They believe they've discovered some true gnosis, or they're just outright bamboozlers and out to make a buck. Now, these are not the goals of the true philosopher. And it becomes evident over time, because truth kind of ultimately has its own staying power. It has its own inherent sufficiency, self-sufficiency to speak directly to the reason of other human beings. Now, unfortunately, not all human beings utilize the faculty of reason that they have appropriately, and that's why not all men are philosophers. But on this topic, we read, the natural thing is for the sick person, rich or poor, to go to the doctor. For anyone who needs to be ruled, to go to the ruler. It isn't for the ruler, if he's truly of any use, to beg others to accept him. It's not for the doctor to beg others to take him. If he's good, it'll happen. And it's the same way with philosophy, right? We don't have to worry so much about all the sophists and bullshitters out there, because the truth will ultimately convince people in the end. And time vindicates the truth. The philosopher must hate falsehood, and this is why virtue is intimately connected to knowledge and metaphysics. This is an argument I've made many times, that you can't divorce these topics. And of course it's very popular in modernity, especially since the Enlightenment and the alterations of pedagogy throughout the last couple hundred years, especially with the Prussian and then Western socialist notions of education and what socialist education is supposed to be. And in that mindset, education is broken down into all of these disparate units that are not connected to one another. Biology has nothing to do with philosophy. Geometry and mathematics have nothing to do with, literature, right? But in the older idea of the Middle Ages of the university, the meaning of the term itself encapsulates the fact that the whole of the universe is a unified exemplification of divine wisdom, providence, foreknowledge, and ultimately divine presence. And that's why modern education and modern pedagogy are actually designed to be corrupting and to have people compartmentalized ultimately into little boxes where they aren't able by design to make connections between fields, and thereby unify all of their philosophies and then understand that it's ultimately theology. A devilish trick, to be sure. The philosopher needs to have a good upbringing. Upbringing is crucial. This is timeless, perennial wisdom. Everybody should know this. However, in our egalitarian, socialistic, leftist, modern context, we don't understand this to be important, because we think that everything is ultimately the fault of our environment. Man's problem is not internal. It's not man's own heart and weakness that is the issue and lack of virtue. It's society, man. It's the man. It's the oppression of those all around us. In actuality, blame can only be laid at the heart of the individual himself for failure to be knowledgeable within one's own due station, of course. Now, good upbringing, being well bred, this is a topic that will carry over into Aristotle as well. Aristotle will agree with Plato that being well bred is crucial to what it is to be a proper guardian and then a proper philosopher king should one rise to that rank. Nurture is crucial because people will continue as they get older to live out the programmed nurturing that they received, be it good or ill. And then, of course, people will follow their peers. And this is a problem, and it's also, unfortunately, just natural, right? People are naturally going to kind of be herd beings. They're going to follow the mass. Why? Because of simply not wanting to be left out. They want to be part of a group. They want to feel a belonging, a sense of unity, a sense of community, which is natural. There's nothing wrong with those things in my view. The problem is that you can have a corrupt society, you can have corruption come in, corrupt philosophers, corrupt leaders and so forth, corrupt education, and then the mass of people will simply follow crooks, con men, mountebanks, and sham artists. These educators and sophists impose by their actions, he says. Now, this is a great quote on the sophist, and he says, they're paid private teachers. They are the sophists, and they are rivals in the craft. They teach anything other than the convictions. They will not teach anything other than the convictions that the majority express. Indeed, they are precisely what this is precisely what sophists call wisdom. Wisdom is mass opinion, according to them. Think of Darwinism. Well, it's true because everybody believes it. All the scientists, so-called, believe it. It must be true. That's sophism. It's as if someone were learning the moods and appetites, Socrates says, of a huge beast, and that is he's rearing, how to handle it, how to hold it, how to train it, right? And through tending this beast over time, he calls this knack for leading the beast wisdom. He gathers himself much information as if this were a craft and starts to teach it. Think of social engineering, right? Think of the Dawkinites and Darwinians and materialists and empiricists who lead the masses out around like a beast with a nuzzle, right? Or the ass with a carrot in front of him. He knows nothing about what these convictions are. He knows nothing of what's good or bad, shameful or just. He just applies all these terms to how the beast reacts. So what is bad? Whatever people don't like. What's good? Whatever people like. Right? Think of the fast-talking con man, the flim-flam guy. Right? That's sort of the monetary equivalent, the business equivalent of the sophist. Plato says that these views are completely ridiculous, right? So, I mean, how do we show that? Well, if the majority of people say that 2 plus 2 is 5, then that makes it so, right? But we obviously think that's ridiculous. We know that's not true, right? It doesn't matter how many people come to the conclusion that 2 plus 2 is 5. It's just simply not. And so this is an obvious demonstration of something you would think would be obvious, but to most people caught in relativism, caught in subjectivism, they can't seem to think outside of themselves. They can't seem to think about something being objective. They can't seem to think about the possibility of how ridiculous that is, even when you demonstrate it. And this is why Socrates says, keep this in mind, that the majority in no way tolerate, accept the reality of beauty itself. Right? The majority out there, the masses, they're not going to understand the form of beauty or the form of good. They're not going to understand that there's a higher realm where things are objectively and unchangingly and eternally true. Why is that? Because the majority cannot be philosophic. They cannot. Hence, they inevitably disapprove of those who practice philosophy. Absolutely, he says. And so, do all of these sophists who associate with the majority then just try to please them? Yep. There you go. That's how society is run. And the nature of the philosopher, though, he says, cannot be corrupted, right? Because the philosopher has seen truth, and he knows that there's truth. And he knows that 2 + 2 is 4. It's not altered or changed by mass opinion. It just is. And that there's a whole bunch of implications that then follow from this. Well, I should say that, to be clear, the true philosopher ultimately, who truly is the true philosopher, can't be corrupted if he perseveres in loving the truth. Philosophers, though, can be, unfortunately, corrupted. And that's one danger, of course. And he says that the philosophy of Athens in his day was just completely degenerate, and there was, I guess, needing in some sense of a philosophic revival, so to speak. And he talks about the pride and arrogance of the youth who think that they're philosophers when they're not. And we see this quite often in internet philosophers, right, who've had no philosophic training, but read a few books and sophomorically think that they're philosophic experts. As a result, he says, won't he exalt himself to great heights and be brimming with pretension and pride that is empty and lacks wisdom and understanding? He certainly will. If someone approaches a young man in that condition and gently tells him truth, that there's no understanding, unless he works laboriously like a slave to attain it, then he will fall into many evils. Yes, and that is the truth. And I can only tell other philosophers out there, and I don't claim to have completely obtained to truth. I think I've obtained to a measure of truth by God's gift, by God's grace. And I would say that to those aspiring to truth, it is laborious. And Basil the Great says much the same thing in his theological treatises, and it's been my experience, I guess 14 or 15 years into, well, no, actually, I guess it would be 16 years into studying philosophy now. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort, but the payoff is worth it. And so there's an interesting discussion next about the way that the sophists will view things in life, and this harkens back to things that we saw in the Apology in the beginning of the book of the beginning of the Republic, book 1 and 2. And he says there are many ways that the philosophic and best nature can be corrupted and destroyed, and he says that this can happen to an individual, and it can happen to the collective, to the city as well. And he says that when you get a bunch of people who are sophists teaching philosophy, like we have at the state schools now, and they fall away from Sophia, divine wisdom, and they leave her desolate and unwed, they lead themselves then lives that are inappropriate and untrue. Well, what do we see from the great universities out there in so-called academia, Princeton, Harvard, Yale? We see the liberal arts and philosophy departments teaching things like Peter Singer, teaching killing babies at age 3, which unfortunately is also a Platonic idea. We see bestiality, we see all sorts of degeneration coming out of these so-called schools of philosophy and liberal arts, as a weaponized strategy of social destruction, social engineering, to break down what is and to rebuild it into the new technocratic state. And I would point out too the similarity here with Solomon's Proverbs. If you've never read Solomon's Proverbs out there, if you're listening to this, I highly recommend that. In fact, I would even say, before going further in Plato's Republic, to stop and read the 30 chapters of 32 chapters of Solomon's Proverbs. I think that that's a better place even to start about wisdom, right? That's what the Proverbs are about. They're kind of a catechetical introduction to wisdom and wisdom literature from King Solomon. And he says that it's reasonable to say all this because for other little men, the ones who are most sophisticated in their little crafts, he says they leap gladly from their little craft into philosophy, and like prisoners escaping from jail, taking refuge in a temple. And despite her present poor state, philosophy is more high-minded than all these little crafts. Right? He says that they're defective people, and then they carry their defective souls into defective philosophy. And the mechanical nature of their work is just the same as the mechanical program nature of their body is then mutilated in the philosophy that they produced. Unworthy men beget unworthy ill philosophy. Boy, isn't that the truth? Yeah. And that's why you see so much degeneration, as I said, in modern day philosophy, so-called. It's degenerated and almost completely into sophism. And that's why the philosopher has to be virtuous and love with truth, because philosophy ultimately is divine. It is theology. It's not. He says it's really divine, and that other natures and ways of life are human. And in theology, that's ultimately what we say. Right? Theology is the ultimate philosophy. It's the real and true philosophy. Philosophy, in terms of human wisdom, is a grasping, a groping, and a pining, as Acts 17 says, after the truth, but not really apprehending. It's a signpost in the right direction, but not the attaining of the actual thing itself. Right? It's like philosophy is like an internet post about a cathedral, right? And then theology is like going to the actual cathedral, to use an analogy. And I'm speaking there of human wisdom and human philosophy. Sometimes these terms could, of course, be interchangeable. Plato thinks that the republic is possible. It is possible to construct this city. It may not happen in your lifetime. It may not, but it is possible, simply because the realm of the forms is real. And if the realm of the forms is real, then it's real that you could construct a rational republic, so to speak. Although the rational republic of Plato is not exactly the same thing as the Enlightenment rationalism that we see in the 17th and 18th century. Now the dialogue progresses to discuss there's a mention of reincarnation again, which is interesting. We've seen that in previous Plato lectures and talks, and the discussion is of Thrasymachus, and that perhaps at a later date he will be reborn and happen upon these arguments. I guess to learn good philosophy, you got to be reborn. Get your right philosophy teaching before you can progress to the higher state in the afterlife. Of course, I don't believe in reincarnation or panpsychism or transmigration of souls, but the discussion as we move on into sections 503 and 4 is concerning two types of people, the active and the contemplative. And for Plato, the philosopher, of course, lives the contemplative life. He's not concerned with going out and building and constructing and chopping down trees and doing all these things. He's got to focus on the realm of the forms and mathematics and geometry and these higher things. This notion of the active versus the contemplative life would, of course, find its way into the history of Christian monasticism, as Saint Pachomius would be one of the first saints of the desert to begin this tradition of Christian monasticism in the 300s, if I recall, that would then extend on into today, where we have, in especially Eastern Christianity, the famed Mount Athos, with the many monastics of Mount Athos in Greece, the center of Eastern monasticism, as well as the Roman, Western, Latin tradition does still maintain monastic orders. And the monastic orders are, as we said, geared around this notion of forsaking or giving up or not being called to married life and the affairs of the world so that one can focus on these kinds of things. It doesn't necessitate or automatically mean that one is more spiritual, especially in the Eastern view, which I think is the more correct view. There's no prelest or spiritual arrogance simply because one is a monastic. It's merely a kind of living that is chosen. We have again the mention of the majority are led about by pleasure and believe that bodily pleasure is the highest and best good, while the more philosophic know that knowledge is a better state of living. Knowing and seeking knowledge is the higher way to live. And then men will seek, of course, but fail to apprehend the good because their good is not based on truth, but on majority opinion and bodily pleasure. And that's why they are led about by their desires and fail to attain to the highest good. And the highest good, as we see on into section 507, is the form. Beauty itself and the good itself and all things that we thereby set down as many, reversing ourselves, we set down according to a single form of each. So it's almost like you could take all the good things out there that are many and build them up into a pyramid, and they reach up to the ultimate good. Take all the beautiful things out there and they reach up into the ultimate beauty. Take all the just things and they reach up into the highest just. And all of those things, the form of good, the form of justice, the form of beauty, are ultimately manifestations of the one. And the forms of these things are the essences of these things. The being of something is taken to refer to its essence. And as we've said, Platonism is an essentialist philosophy, which means that it believes in the metaphysical reality of essences. Things have an essence which makes them what they are. So a tree, the essence of a tree is its characteristic or property or feature that is timeless, eternal, and is what makes it that thing. The secondary external characteristics, such as this leaf, that leaf, a green leaf, a red leaf, this tree, that bark, that trunk, that's not the essential characteristics of that object, but there is in fact behind it a formal higher order that makes it what it is. Next we will come to the discussion of light, lux, and how light is an analogy. And we're going to understand here the Platonic view of epistemology or knowledge and how it will have a fourfold tier or hierarchy to it that will culminate in the highest form of knowledge, which is noetic. And it will be like the sun, right? God, the one, right? The divine. You can see that like it's the sun as an analogy. But it's not a sun out there in space. It's a sun that is the sun of the intellectual realm. God is like the sun, but to the intelligible realm. And that's going to be important for understanding what we come to in Book 7, the allegory of the cave. So we're going to read a little bit here because this is going to be one of the most important sections in this book and in the Republic as a whole. we read, I mean what you call light. Yes, then it isn't an insignificant kind of link that connects the sense of sight and the power to be seen. It is a more valuable link than any other linked things we've gotten. Sight by nature is related to God in this way. Yes, it is. Sight isn't the sun, nor is sight itself that which it comes to be, namely the eye. But it is the most sun-like of the senses. It receives from the sun the power that it has, just like an influx from an overflowing treasury. The sun is not sight, but isn't it the cause of sight itself by what is seen? Yes. Let's say then that this is what I call the offspring of the good, which the good begot as its analog. What the good itself is in the intelligible realm in relationship to the understanding and the intelligible things, the sun is in the visible realm in relationship to sight and visible things. And understand the soul in the same way. When it focuses on something illuminated by truth and what is, it understands, knows, and apprehends and possesses understanding. But when it focuses on what is mixed with obscurity and on what passes away, it makes opinions, and it is dimmed, and it changes opinions this way and that, and it becomes bereft of understanding. The good, you see, I'm saying, is the cause and object of knowledge we begin to learn here. Returning again to Plato. So that what gives truth to the things that is known and the power to know the knower is the form of the good. And though it is the cause of knowledge and truth, it is also an object of knowledge. Both knowledge and truth are beautiful things, but the good is other and more beautiful than they. In the visible realm, light and the sun are rightly considered sun-like, but it is wrong to think that they are the sun. And so here it is right to think of knowledge and truth as godlike, but wrong to think that either of them is the good, for the good is yet more prized. This is an interesting analogy because this is used by some of the Eastern Fathers in the Orthodox Church to understand the difference between person, nature, and energy. And so when we speak of God in a way kind of like the sun, and the Fathers use this same analogy that Plato uses. They speak of God as the sun, right? And then who God is as different from the light that comes from the sun and the heat that comes from the sun, right? But they're all the same source, and they come to us together in a unified way, yet they're distinct. The light is not the same thing as the heat, right? And they're not the same thing as the sun. In the same way, God is not the same thing as his actions, right? His energies. Energies are actions. And there are diverse energies. Justice is not the same thing as foreknowledge, yet they all come from the same source. We have two realms then, right? The realm in Plato of the form, and the realm of the forms, ultimately culminating in the good, and then the realm of our existence, which is change and flux, which is participates metexis, as we saw before, in the good, but in a very dim sense. And now he says to understand the levels of knowledge, right? We'll have noesis, which is at the top, which is understanding, and that's true knowledge. It's noetic light. We have thought, which is discursive, which we call dianoia in the Greek, right? This is reasoning from one thing to the next. We have belief, which is opinion, pistis in the Greek here, and then we have aikasia, which is imagination, just kind of dreaming up stuff, and that's the lowest form of knowledge. So people who just make up stuff, right? Just dreaming and having imaginings, this is the lowest form. We move up to people who have an opinion on things, but they don't really know about it. That is pistis. Thought, which is discursive reasoning about a thing. He must have done this, and I think this, and then there was this, and so this. And then we have, beyond that, is noesis, which is noetic light, perceiving the forms as they are in truth, in eternality, in true being. And this also would be something that would carry over into Eastern Christianity. Not Platonism, but these topics in terms of how they're taught in the Old and New Testaments scriptures of the Bible. Paul, for example, will talk about the light of Christ in 2 Corinthians, and the church fathers would use this to speak of the way that in Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, I think it's 11, Mount Tabor, the light of Mount Tabor, we see the light coming off of the Logos, who is Jesus. And that light is the same light that's spoken of in John 1. In the beginning was the Word, right? And then the light of God is what gives birth to creation. Also, all through, of course, the book of John is the topic of the light, the divine light. And for Roman Catholic or Latin theology, that light is a created light. It's a created manifestation of knowing God through a creaturely means. In Eastern theology, the divine light is a direct perception of the divine energies. Very, very different theologies there, and a very important distinction between the two. So the line is kind of similar to the chain of being, and that's the line that we've drawn from the lowest level of knowledge up to the highest, being the noesis. And Plato says that you divide each one of these in half as you go. So the line is divided in half, and then the bottom half is divided in half, and then that bottom half is divided in half. And he thinks that these are the measures of knowledge, right? So the little bitty chunk at the bottom is imagination, belief is a little bit bigger, thought a little bit bigger, and then understanding or noesis is the biggest, and it's the fullness of them all. Now, the noesis is what obtains knowledge of the forms, and the forms, as we said, is true ontology. And so it could even be said in Plato that epistemology is metaphysics in the Republic and in Plato's philosophy. Now, one thing that's crucial here that I think is one of the best arguments across the board in Platonism, and if we were to try to salvage anything out of Plato that would tie into the many other talks that I've given, especially on the subject of, say, transcendental arguments, it would be this. And I have some pieces I've written, Numbers Prove God, for example, or other pieces I've written about transcendental arguments you can find at Jay's Analysis. And partly we can see the trend for that kind of argumentation here. We read, know that although they use, he's talking about mathematicians or geometers who use these mathematical forms and concepts, but don't really understand what they're doing the way a philosopher understands. Know that they use visible figures and they make claims about them, but their creed isn't directed to them, but to those other things that they are like. They make their claims for the sake of the square itself, the diagonal itself, and not what they draw, not the diagonal that they draw on the chalkboard or the square that they draw. These figures that they make and draw are shadows and reflections, images, right? And they are after the things that are found by means of thought. So when you draw a triangle on a chalkboard, it's not the ultimate triangle, right? And so we know that it's not a perfect triangle because when a human draws one, it's subject to some degree of flaw or incorrect, out of shape lines, right? And even if we do one on a computer, there's still some measure of imperceptibility or imperfection in that triangle. But we know that there is a perfect triangle because the degrees of all the angles add up perfectly, right? A right angle. 90 degrees is not something that only exists in the material realm. A chiliagon, a thousand-sided figure, right, does not really exist in nature. I suppose somebody could theoretically create a chiliagon, But that object is not something that we see in the world. The number 7 is not in the world. It's outside of the world. And so when you erase the number 7, it does not disappear, destroy, or go away. And this proves from math and geometry that there is a realm of the forms. And this is what so many mathematicians and philosophers have said for so long, even philosophers today. And we read that moving from form to form, we end in form in the realm of mathematics and geometry. And this is key here. Do not go back. These sophists move from their sense perceptions, but they never get beyond it. And they proceed from hypothesis to hypothesis. You seem to me to call the state of geometers thought but not understanding, thought being intermediate between opinion and understanding. The response is, you are correct. There are 4 such conditions of the soul corresponding to the 4 subsections of our outline. Those who have understanding at the top, those who use discursive thought second, those who have beliefs third, and those who make up things fourth. Arranging them in a ratio, consider that each one shares in the clarity to a degree of the subsection that is set over them. Understand, agree, and arrange these as I say. And so mathematicians, he's saying, need to be philosophers. Mathematicians kind of operate in that realm of the discursive, right? Discursive reasoning, one thing to the next, logical conclusion, 2 + 2 is 4 times 8, 32, etc., etc. And now that is discursive, and it is thought, but it's still not noesis because you're not considering math theory, number theory. And that is what Plato's doing. And he's saying that that shows you a higher level of being beyond this realm, the realm of the forms, higher dimensions, etc. And I had a guy this week, for example, message me and say, you are ridiculous for saying that ancient philosophers speak of higher dimensions and realms. Excuse me, here you go, book 6 of the Republic. So don't listen to the philosophers and the philosophs and the sophists out there that will be teaching you materialism and the idea that the realm of sensate matter and flux is all there is. They are liars and deceivers, and they're not true philosophers. They're lacking the noetic light that ultimately comes from God and the love of truth. You're listening to Jay's Analysis. This is my podcast on the Republic, Book 6. Stay tuned. Next week we will move to Book 7, which is also equally deep and contains one of the most famous stories in the history of philosophy, the allegory of the cave. And we will decode that in light of all that we've seen so far and how that is crucial to what we just saw with the Platonic principle of illumination. No, not the Illuminati. Illumination from the divine, from the realm of the intelligible, the realm of the forms, the noetic light, the illumination that comes from the divine. And we're going to see how that is explained in the famous perennial allegory of the cave.